So a few days ago, a friend sent me this Clint Black song, which he suggested might have ripped its vocal line off from I Can't Dance.
Bottle of Scotch whiskey, not very smooth, like snake bite cure from the medicine man.
Hot sun beating down, burning my feet just walking around.
Now the resemblance there is kind of amusing. I assume it's coincidental. Both songs use a simple, generic enough vocal line that that level of similarity is easy to write off as an accident. I think it's more about the badness of I Can't Dance than it is about Clint Black being a plagiarist. But it made me think that maybe one of the things that rubs me the wrong way about I Can't Dance is the sense that it somehow accidentally exists in the wrong genre. And, maybe a country version of it would actually be more successful. And then I kind of thought, well, that might be an interesting project, actually, looking up some of the more significant covers of Genesis songs, picking which ones work and which ones don't, thinking about why, maybe get a nice little ranking video out of it. I'll admit here that I don't have much of an interest in covers, either as a musician or a listener, and I think it's particularly hard to cover a band like Genesis, where the early stuff has a great deal of distinctive, finely crafted instrumental detail. The later stuff has quite a bit of distinctive, finely crafted sonic detail. If you carefully recreate every element, then there's no point to your version existing. But it's hard to change things without your version coming out more generic. And there's so much going on in the song that there are a bunch of little decision points. There's another issue with Genesis covers, which is that their lyrics usually have a very distinct character that almost always feels awkward when you hear it coming out of someone else's voice. Even Peter and Phil, even if they didn't write most of the lyrics themselves, there's still a naturalness that they have with that material that a lot of other singers don't. When you're hearing a really effective cover, I think you should have the intuitive sense that the person singing could have written it, right? And that's a totally undefinable, subjective sense, but I think you can recognize that kind of authenticity, the way that somebody might live within a song. And the more generic a set of lyrics are, the easier they are to do that with, right? The more that they use odd images or complicated phrases, the harder that is, right? And Genesis are a band where the lyrics, I think, are hard for many people to kind of exist in convincingly. Even the songs I don't personally like that much. So to some extent, I'm going into this video a bit skeptical of the idea that there is much point in covering a Genesis song beyond, maybe creating a curio to toss in with your Japanese edition bonus tracks, or maybe just playing the thing for the joy of playing it, which is great for the player, but not necessarily going to be that interesting to the listener, particularly in a studio recording. A few notes about how I've determined this list. First, I'm not making any pretense at all here to objectivity, and if I don't like the original, then the cover will probably be ranked lower. Second, if you really like any of these bands, or if you really like any of these cover versions, maybe don't watch this video. And third, to keep it manageable, my cutoff here was that to qualify for this video, the artist had to have at least 10,000 monthly listeners on Spotify, be known primarily for creating original work, right? Obviously, the internet is full of more covers than I could ever begin to count or pay attention to, and I had to rule most of them out to give myself a manageable task. In the process of making this video, I discovered that there are, for instance, 8 different metal covers of Easy Lover, which really does feel to me like some kind of apocalyptic endpoint where the world is full of such an incredible amount of artistic stuff that the culture basically chokes to death on its own vomit, right? With that hopeful image, let's go through the ranking. In last place, I have Sonata Arctica, a Finnish power metal band that I don't really know anything about, aside from the fact that from 1995 to 1997, they were called Tricky Beans, and that in 2014, they covered I Can't Dance. In their version, they've traded out the keyboard percussion for conventional drumming, but the main riff here has been enhanced, if that's the word for it, with what's either the horn setting on a very cheap keyboard or a live horn section that's been played, recorded, and mixed to sound like a cheap keyboard. So what's fascinating here is that they've somehow managed to find an instrumental texture that can make the song even less appealing. It's miraculous in its way, but I can't help but wonder about all the Sonata Arctica fans who only slightly know Genesis who will hear this and assume that they suck dreadfully. I have no choice but to put it in last place. Next up, we have In Flames' version of Land of Confusion. Now, In Flames, of course, if you're not familiar with them, were a Swedish death metal band who were among the most successful at unifying melodic Iron Maidenish leads, chunky thrash riffing, and the guitar tone and vocal style of death metal, which at the time felt like a revolutionary stylistic idea, and to its credit did serve as a bridge which allowed a lot of young people from that era to find their way from heavier radio metal bands like Slipknot or Mudvayne into the whole wider world of death and black metal, myself, as you might guess, being one of those people. What makes their version interesting, for lack of a kinder word, is that they take all the syncopation out of the rhythm, play it completely flat and straight to the point that it becomes kind of unrecognizable. I'm not even sure how to describe what's happening there, really. It's like they have the guitar tabs and the lyric sheet, but they've never heard the actual song, and they're just kind of taking their best guess at how it might go. Or, like one guy in the band has heard the song, but they don't have access to a recording of it. He's trying to describe it to them, but he can't really get it across, and it comes out kind of distorted like a game of telephone. The singer in particular, when he does clean vocals on the bridge, sings totally different notes than the original. It sounds less like a distortion of the original version and more just something that's being made up without really any knowledge of the original. Now, I do understand that you don't have to play a cover straight, right? You can tinker with any aspect of it that you want to make it feel more like yours, and perhaps there's no point in doing a cover if you don't do that. But in this case, they've turned it into something awkward and unpleasant. It's so wrong that it feels actively uncomfortable, and I probably find this less enjoyable to listen to than maybe anything else on this list. I really can't think of anything fair except to tie it out for last place. Next up is Debauchery's cover of, once again, I Can't Dance. Now, I don't know much about this German death metal band, except that based on photos of their stage show, based on their album titles, based on the fact that most of their lyrics are apparently about Warhammer, they appear to be basically doing kind of like a generic store brand version of Gwar. Maybe that's unfair, but I can't really imagine that's unfair. Anyway, this is a fascinating cover because they've kept basically every detail of the arrangement, including the stupid keyboard percussion, but the vocal style is rather different. So regular viewers of the channel will know that I'm notorious for never smiling, but I have to admit that made me smile. That brought me real legitimate joy. That warmed something deep inside me like spring sunlight on a frozen lake. It actually made me like I Can't Dance more. The lead singer apparently had to give up a career as a high school philosophy teacher to do this band. His sacrifice is deeply appreciated. I never want to hear it again. I'm tying it for last. Next in the ranking is Keane's version of That's All. Keane, if you don't know them, are a British rock band that are very, very popular in the UK. Not nearly so well known in the US. The only thing of theirs that I know is their first album, Hopes and Fears, which I have a very intense emotional relationship with due to some personal stuff that I wouldn't dream of going into here. But that is actually an interesting album because it's covered in Yamaha CP70 electric piano, which is an instrument with a really distinct sound that, to my knowledge, was hardly ever used after the 1980s. So it's rather strange to encounter it as one of the defining sonic elements of a very popular rock album from 2004. And of course, the sound of the CP70 is all over early 80s Genesis, so there's some sonic tie between that era of Keane and that era of Genesis. It's not surprising at all that they would cover That's All, which is a song that relies really heavily on the CP70. It's actually a surprisingly apt match of song and artist, one of the most so on this list. So let's hear a bit of it.
Well, I could say day, and you could say night. Tell me it's right when I know that it's right.
Tied for last. Next up, we have Disturbed covering Land of Confusion. These guys, of course, are a radio metal band that were briefly pretty popular in the early 2000s and have stuck around with a decent enough fan base. I have a particular dislike for Disturbed based on a very specific thing. I went to Ozfest in 2003, which was a traveling metal festival show. And Disturbed were one of the headlining bands that year. Now, I was 19, and, these big festival shows, when you're young and you're broke, you get up at 5 a.m., you drive for hours, you walk around all day in the blazing summer sun in what's essentially a giant parking lot. They don't let you bring in food or drinks, so you're starved, you're dehydrated. It is a miserable, miserable ordeal. Now, Disturbed, being a headliner, were playing rather late in the day. I'm sitting somewhere on the big grassy hill facing the main stage. I'm sitting down, I'm resting, just kind of waiting for their set to be over, trying to preserve whatever little bit of remaining stamina I have so I can eventually drive home without falling asleep at the wheel and dying. Then David Draymond, the lead singer of Disturbed, finds some kids in wheelchairs, gets them up on stage with him. That's great, very noble, good gesture. And then he says something like, I don't remember the exact words, but very close to, in the face of these wheelchairs, everyone out there who isn't on their feet right now should be ashamed of themselves. And I was just like, fuck you, buddy. I have gone to incredible effort and expense to be here. I'm as exhausted as I've ever been in my whole life, and you're leveraging disabled kids to guilt me over the fact that I'm not showing more enthusiasm for your shitty, mediocre set. You are a pompous ass, and I vow in this moment that as long as I live, I will hate your band. And I've kept that vow. I fucking hate Disturbed. Anyway, the Genesis cover. So this is actually pretty well done. The song's riff has a particular kind of staccato lockstep quality between drum and bass and guitar that's already similar to how a lot of metal arrangements work, right? So it's not too much of a leap to play it in a metal way, but there are a lot of metal bands that have done this song, including In Flames earlier on this list, and the underlying rhythm, I think, is more creative and syncopated and complicated than what a lot of metal bands would do with that sort of musical texture, right? In Flames kind of rushed it. They said, fuck it. They just sort of reduced it to bland chunk. Disturbed have been much more careful and thoughtful about what makes the original work and how to replicate its particular rhythmic elements with a different sonic texture. Take a listen. But then you still got David Draymond being a smug, pompous ass. There's a characteristic moment in this track near the end of the middle eight when Draymond removes the line, "The sound of your laughter," replaces it with "in the wake of this madness." I guess because he thought that would be more dark and dramatic.
Now the stars will ride all through the night in the wake of this madness as I held you.
But you have to remember that the first line in the middle eight is, "I remember long ago." So how are these events occurring in the wake of this madness, a present tense statement, while also being something he remembers from long ago? That doesn't make any chronological sense. He's tried to make the song darker and more intense by changing that lyric, but instead has just kind of made it muddled. Now, obviously, that's not a big enough thing to ruin what is instrumentally a pretty successful cover, but I just fucking hate Disturbed, and I'm going to tie them for last. All right, so thank you for your time and attention to this list. Sooner or later, I'll get around to part 2, which will be all the ones that are not tied for last. Hope everybody had a good time, and I'll see you next week.